Okay, good morning, everybody. So, as I said yesterday, I would just make a relatively quick video just to finish off yesterday's lesson, the sort of 15 minutes or so that we would normally have had if we'd had the full hour. So I'm making up that time now, just finishing off the key points from yesterday's video. So have the mind map in front of you, and as you would in the lesson, just work on the mind mapping. Have the notes, the class notes. Remember the class notes that I gave you in the lesson yesterday. You've got them on the screen here as well. Okay. The software I use forces me to go to the very beginning of the slideshow, so just bear with me while I scroll through to the point that we reached. Okay, so that's the mind map. We started off by looking at the economic takeoff, the first industrial revolution of the 1850s and 1860s, the fact that there was a dip in the second half of the 1870s through into the 1880s, and then the real industrial takeoff started in the beginning of the 1890s. And we looked at the key features of each. Remember, the first industrial revolution was primarily primary industry, and then the second industrial revolution was mainly secondary and tertiary industry, manufacturing and services, etc. And then we looked at the German economy in 1914. The state, and by that point, Germany had overtaken Britain as the workshop of the world, as Britain used to be called, and now Germany, certainly in terms of Europe, was the leading industrial nation, and in particular electricity and chemicals, precision instruments, precision equipment, Zeiss cameras, etc., motor vehicles. And we then looked at the fact there were long-term causes that would explain the first industrial revolution from the 1850s and 1860s, but the short-term causes is what we're really interested in with regards to the industrial takeoff that began in the late 1880s and early 1890s. Okay, so that's the sort of point that we had reached. Okay, so there's our long-term causes. Useful diagram. Remember the difference between long-term and short-term. Short-term basically means why it happened then when it did. Okay, long-term explains why it happened, but not necessarily answering the question why it happened when it did. Okay, so when we're looking at the industrial takeoff, which was the second industrial revolution beginning in the early 1890s, we're really focusing in on the short-term issues. Okay, so those are long-term issues. So the short-term issues, and this was the sort of point that we reached. Okay, so in a nutshell, the massive acceleration of German industry. Nice word to use, that word acceleration. Looking for sort of those sort of key terms. Okay, the massive acceleration there of German industry after 1871 was primarily caused by a deliberate, government policy of intervening. These are key words that I'm underlining, that you should be transferring onto your mind map somewhere, in economic matters. Now, the traditional approach, as we said in the lesson yesterday, the sort of standard approach for other nations before Germany came along, was created in 1871, was that governments left alone, they didn't really get involved in economic matters. They instead allowed what we call market forces, just normal supply and demand, the business market, to sort of decide economic growth and development without the government interfering by setting the rules. Okay. Now, that seems strange to us from today, from the 21st century perspective, because we are used to governments setting the rules for the economy. They intervene with taxation, and they will set the bank rates, and they will have a budget, and all sorts of things that the government can do to set the rules. Okay, but the point is that, as I say, Britain in particular, which led the way, their approach was what we call laissez-faire, to leave alone. Okay, so what's really significant about, if we're trying to understand why it was that Germany accelerated and overtook Britain, is what did Germany do differently? And the key thing that Germany did differently is there was government intervention in the economy, which is a completely sort of new thing. Okay, and the type of things that we need to just go through now are these things here. Okay, which you didn't have yesterday. Have time to look at yesterday. Okay, and all of those things, to a large extent, explain why the industrial takeoff happened. Okay, but it's also important to remember that it wasn't all positives. There were negative consequences, and the negative consequences were especially important for the consumers, the ordinary people, the ordinary Germans, particularly the people at the kind of bottom of the social pyramid, the lower classes, and in particular the working classes in the cities, who that new social group. And so, to a large extent, this sort of this industrial takeoff, it generated wealth, but it also generated an uneven distribution of wealth. Okay, the working classes did not benefit as much as the upper classes, and so what it actually did is it accelerated that fracturing of society that we've already talked about, this sort of increasingly sharp division between the rich and poor in Germany. Okay, and that will partly explain the rise of socialism, which we'll look at next lesson. Okay, that sort of idea, that new ideology that working class people began to grasp hold of and believe, in particular Marxism, that society should be reshaped to give more to them. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. Now, obviously, we need to delve into that. So I had that slide on the screen, and just to really highlight the point that, remember, this is a Section C topic that we're building up over the 2 years. Section C covers 120 years of history, and you can get two types of questions. One is about the development of society over the 120 years, or the second one is the development of the German economy over the 120 years. Now, clearly, if you get a German economy question that you answer in Section C, then you have got to be aware of what the most likely question could be. And half of the possible questions out there, having pulled them all together from different sources, as you can see, they're all highlighted there, are about this issue of government intervention. Okay, so this is the first piece of the jigsaw puzzle. We're looking at government intervention 1871 to 1914. You will have to write an essay about government intervention 1871 to 1990. Okay, notice how all the questions focus in on 1871 to 1990, 120 years of history. Okay, so let's just go through and just make sure that you're clear of the sort of key things are. Okay, that you need to be. We'll just go through this, make sure you understand it. So, government economic policies during the Kaiserreich, 1871 to 1914, had a varied effect on the German economy, some of which were positive. Okay, so some of those effects were positive, and I think that's important. When you write about this in the exam, you probably need to distinguish between the positive and the negative effects. Okay, so the German government rigorously pursued state intervention in key industries by providing, for example, subsidies to key industries, in other words, handouts of money. Okay, in a sense, the way the British government is doing that at the moment as a result of the pandemic through the furlough scheme. Okay, that's a form of subsidy. Okay, the government will step in, intervene, and help out private businesses. These businesses are privately owned, but the government will provide a prop-up of support. Okay, so the German government in the Second Reich did that. Okay, so for example, they subsidised gas and water. Now, if you went to Britain at that time, that sort of thing never happened. Okay, gas and water supplies were completely owned and run by private businesses, and the British government the policy was to leave alone. Okay, so that was one factor. And then the government also encouraged what we call the creation of cartels to ensure. Now what this did is it ensured there was less competition, and that resulted in greater profits and economic stability for these companies. Now, basically, what a cartel is, it's when two big private businesses, two or more, will combine and decide to work together to set the prices, okay, and to decide the rules of the game between themselves, okay. Now, by doing that, they will often, if two big businesses work together, they will often price out of the market the smaller businesses who simply cannot compete. That's what we mean by less competition. Okay, that sort of thing happens today in the world today. I mean, for example, Google bought YouTube. They were originally, as far as I understand, two separate businesses, but then Google bought YouTube. And the combination of those two enormous private businesses was huge in the sense that it's very, very difficult for anyone else, other similar businesses, to sort of like get into the business of providing that type of service to the customers of the world. So smaller businesses are basically pushed out of the market. Okay, and that's what we mean by cartels. So what it does is it stabilizes the market for those companies that combine. They're pretty guaranteed to survive, aren't they? Okay, because they have been allowed to form and combine. And the point we're making here is that was a form of government intervention. The German government deliberately encouraged the creation of these cartels. I think there was something like 366 different cartels in Germany by the start of the 20th century. Okay, so it very much works in the interests of the big private businesses, not the small businessmen, but the big private businesses. Okay, that's the first an area. So the lettering seems to have lost itself there. It was A, B, and it's gone back to A, but never mind. Okay, protectionism. Now, this is another example of how the German government intervened. Okay, and this was a feature under Bismarck, the first German Chancellor. Okay, Otto von Bismarck. And it was from the late 1870s. Now we'll look at this more when we do the first depth study. But basically, what protectionism is a policy of introducing trade taxes that we call tariffs. That's a key word. Okay, on imports. Now, imports are goods from other countries that when other countries want to sell their goods on the German market. So, for example, wheat from Russia or America. Okay, so let's say, for example, American farmers wanted to sell their wheat to German customers. They've obviously got to bring their wheat into Germany. So what a tariff is when the American businessmen bring their wheat across the German border into Germany, they have to pay a tax to the German government, and that's what we call a tariff. It's a trade tax. Okay. Now, obviously, if you've had to do that, okay, if an American farmer has got to pay taxes to get their grain into Germany, in order to cover the costs of those taxes when they sell their grain to the German people, they've got to put the price of the grain up. So American grain becomes more expensive. So therefore, the German consumers, the ordinary people who want to buy grain, will probably choose to buy German grain rather than American grain. Okay, so protectionism, therefore, is protecting the German product, whatever it may be. And I've used one example, wheat. Okay, so that's really what protectionism is. So what that basically did is it basically sorry, something's gone wrong with my just bear with me, I need to pause it. Can't fix this particular slide. It's disappeared into the into a very small version. So I'll just finish off the slide by speaking you through it. So as I was saying, what protectionism does is it basically protects homegrown industry. Okay, and it was introduced by Bismarck. It saved German jobs. Okay, it's protecting, using that example, German farmers against competition of cheap products from abroad by making foreign products more expensive on the market. Okay, but, and here's the negative, obviously on the other hand, if you're putting up tariffs to make, for example, American wheat more expensive to protect homegrown wheat, then potentially it's eliminating competition from abroad, which ultimately means that the German farmers can, they knowing they're being protected, can set high bread prices. So in the end, it's not really going to help ordinary people. Food was expensive for ordinary people if you're living in Imperial Germany. And that was obviously one of the key features. And what we're trying to understand is, as we know, we'll see this next lesson, in particular if you lived in these growing industrial cities, that grain, the cost of food is high, so it made it tough for you to live. Less so in the countryside, because if you're living in the countryside, you're more likely, you're closer to the food production, and you're more likely to be able to access it. But in particular, these people living in these overcrowded, growing industrial cities, one of the additional pressures, in addition to those sort of pressures of, sort of like tough working conditions, etc., etc., is food was expensive, and it largely came out of this policy of protectionism. Okay, so the next thing you need to talk about is commercial treaties. Now, the Chancellor who followed after after Bismarck was Chancellor Caprivi, who is mentioned there. And basically, a commercial treaty is when the government steps in and signs treaties about trade with other countries. Okay, and that was a key feature of Caprivi. He made various trading agreements with some countries that actually lowered tariffs. Okay, so with Italy, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Belgium, Switzerland, Romania, for example, importers from businessmen from those countries were able to bring their goods, such as cattle, timber, and grain, fairly cheaply into Germany. So that made those goods cheaper on the German market. Okay, and in return, those countries guaranteed Germany a market for their exports. So German businessmen could therefore sell their goods abroad in Austria, Russia, Italy, etc., without having to pay taxes to those countries' governments. So it kind of counterbalanced protectionism, those sort of commercial treaties. Okay, but again, that's examples of government intervention that you need to be aware of. And then the next feature, very important, and we'll look at this when we do depth study 1. From the 1898 onwards, now German governments invested very heavily in German naval building. Okay, the building of a German navy. Now, if you think about Germany, Germany is almost a completely landlocked nation. And as a landlocked nation, you'd thought, well, why would she need to have a navy? Britain, on the other hand, the traditional world power, until Germany came along and overtook her, Britain does need a navy because she's an island. But this was largely a result of the policies of this man here, the emperor, who became the emperor in 1890, Emperor William II, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who, for whatever reasons, had a passionate interest in naval building. And so because he was the emperor, the head of state, chancellors, heads of government who worked underneath him, were very driven by government intervention to support naval building. And so the government therefore made contracts, agreements with German industrialists such as Krupp, steel industrialists in particular, for the manufacture of warships, of battleships. And one of the key types of battleships was the so-called dreadnought. Okay, and it's a related topic, but it had a side effect of increasing tensions between Germany and Britain. I mean, obviously the tensions anyway, because Germany was overtaking Britain in the industrial race. But now, in terms of a naval race, it increased the tensions further. And that were tensions that partly led to the outbreak of war in 1914. Okay. Other government encouraged developments. Railways, stretches of railways were brought under direct government ownership. That's what we call nationalisation. And other services like the postal service, the telephones and the telegraph were completely owned by the government. There was no private ownership of any of those. So that again is examples of government intervention. And there's that sort of key point. That was all in marked contrast to Britain, where the British government pursued a laissez-faire approach. Now, cartels then, we've already touched upon those, but a little bit more detailed. Again, this is an example of government intervention. There's one example of Alfred Cupp. He's the person we mentioned earlier that they formed an agreement with, a contract with, who really benefited, one of the big industrialists of the German era. Okay, so cartels are when groups of industrialists combine to control prices, production levels, and marketing. So in effect, they will corner the market, as we say, and so small businessmen simply will not be able to compete against the cartels, okay, for whatever the cartels are producing. And what the German government did is they provided legal protection. Now, again, in the 21st century, there's a sort of understanding that cartels are not really very good for competition because they push the small businessman out of the market who can't compete. And competition is generally good. So in the 21st century, governments tend to intervene to stop cartels happening. But that was a very different. This is the sort of point that in the Kaiserreich it was the reverse. The government legally protected the cartels. They were seen as a way of achieving what we call economies of scale. That if two big industrialists, two big businesses combine, they can make things cheaper. Okay, they can combine their profits, find new ways, invest in scientific research to find new ways of making things that will be cheaper, and arguably then by doing that they can make their goods cheaper. Okay, whatever they're producing will be produced more cheaply. They can sell them more cheaply on the market. Okay, and therefore the small businessman who can't invest, for example, in high technology equipment for the manufacture of goods, perhaps because they've got a small little factory and they can't buy big conveyor belts or whatever it may be. And the small businessman simply can't, if they're going to make it, they're going to have to basically make it in a more expensive way. And so the small businessman will have to sell their goods at a higher price. And so the cartels, therefore, because they're going to produce lower price goods, will corner the market. Okay, so it was a uniquely German phenomenon. At the time, for example, the other major industrial powers, Britain and America, didn't agree with that. Okay, they believed in what we call leave alone, laissez-faire, allow free, open competition in the market. By keeping domestic prices high, because it corners the market, and so basically, although it means they can produce goods more cheaply, they can also then set their prices, okay, and they can agree, well, we're not going to lower prices any more than that, okay, and that's often what cartels would do. And so by keeping those domestic prices high, they can use their profits to subsidize goods that they would basically want to sell abroad. Okay, so they can basically lower the prices of goods that they want to sell abroad, and thus that would gain markets abroad for their goods, which is another reason for cartels. And by 1905 there were 366 cartels compared to 90 in 1885, which shows you how much they expanded. Examples of cartels: Rhineland-Westphalia Coal Syndicate. That's two companies, the Rhineland Company and the Westphalia Company. They combined. Thyssen combined with AG. And AG also combined with Krupp. And then in 1908, a deal of AEG and Siemens. So AEG was sort of bigger cartel companies. Economic historians today question the long-term benefits of cartels because they say it stifles innovation. If you're cornered out of the market, there are so, Google and YouTube, for example, price all the competitors out of the market. Well, those small competitors who might want to compete against them, if there was more open competition, they may come across better ways of doing things. Okay, so similar in the 19th century, it arguably limits innovation. That's a disadvantage of Cartels. Okay, and then just to conclude, a couple of other features that provided a short-term stimulus to the industrial takeoff in Germany. Germany had the best elementary education system in the world. Okay, that's basically schooling. Higher education, universities, also were developed in such a way by Germany, possibly because education developed late. The universities developed late. They learned from Britain. Britain had these very old universities that were sort of like very rooted in traditional academic disciplines like Latin, etc. Well, these new German universities kind of like looked at what do we want to teach our university students, and so they decided, well, hold it, we're not going to just do it exclusively academic subjects like Latin and history. We'll actually use universities to train graduates to support industrial development. So the German universities were producing a lot of graduates who went into industrial research, engineering and scientific research, etc. So Germany was ahead of the game, ahead of other countries like Britain, when it came to using universities to support economic development. Okay, so these new German universities that came late on the scene expanded rapidly. There was huge enrolment to universities. Okay, and then finally, another key feature was the German banking system. Now, the German banking system was very free from government control, which enabled the banks to be very, very innovative. So this is almost a point contrary to government intervention. In a sense, the government allowed the banks to be very independent, and therefore the banks were risk takers. Okay, and were very generous in their approach. And so what the banks did is they were very prepared to loan money to German businessmen like Krupp, etc., and for a long period of time, and these businessmen would pay back their loans over a long period of time. So that basically supported these big businesses that fueled the German industrial takeoff, and as a result of that, banks played a big part in it. Also, banks were directly involved in industrial research. Okay, so that's another thing. The banks very much supported the research that we talked about there. Okay, from the universities, etc. And so the German businesses had a lot of support employing scientists who would be researching new ways of producing whatever they were producing for them. So, and that was all backed by the German banks. Okay, with this long-term credit scheme. And then also the boards of directors of the leading German businesses often included leading bankers. So the banks had a direct stake in the business. Okay, a board of directors are the board of a business. Say, for example, Krupp or Thyssen or AEG would have a board of directors. Well, that on that board of directors would be representatives from the banks. And the purpose of a board of directors is to ensure the business is run to make a profit. So the banks, if they're on the board of directors, have got a direct interest in making sure the business is profitable. So that again was a sort of key feature of why there was an industrial takeoff in Germany. Okay, so there's our overall nutshell diagram which I gave to you today. That's a reminder of what we're going to do next lesson, which will now be tomorrow, Friday. So make sure you do the reading on that. And that's the end of this slideshow. Hopefully that was useful for you. Sorry we had a technical problem in the middle of it.